morning and welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. In tonight's edition, Rod Driver is going to be delivering a pre-recorded presentation about the evidence for climate change as part of our Elephant in the Room series. Please let us know what you think about it in the comments section. So over to Rod now.
So today's presentation is to ask lots and lots of questions about the future predictions of climate change catastrophe. And I've researched this on and off for the last 20 years, but certainly in the last year, I decided to research it much more seriously. And what I found was that every time I tried to research a topic, I just had more and more questions about the mainstream narrative that is being presented to us by those who are predicting climate doom within the next 50 to 100 years. So there's this huge amount of what I would call propaganda saying that climate change is this great big threat to mankind, and in order to solve it, we have to make all of these changes to our energy system. Well, so I spent a bit of time looking at the documents from the International Panel on Climate Change. So it's usually referred to as the IPCC. So that's considered to be the main body that puts out reports every few years explaining what's going on. And what I found is that even they are starting to tone down their most extreme claims. And in fact, what I've seen looking through their documents is that climate change might cause some problems, but it certainly isn't an end-of-the-world scenario that requires any degree of panic. It's sort of localized problems that we should be able to deal with sort of one at a time on their own merit. So I'm going to walk people through this sort of series of things that I've been researching and the questions that I have and what is sort of agreed and what is not agreed, and the differences with the mainstream presentation in the media. So the first thing is to look at how much temperatures have increased. And if you read the press, you'll often see articles saying 97% of climate scientists agree with, and then they'll put a simple phrase like climate change or global warming. So what they're saying is that there is a large group of scientists, a very large proportion of scientists who specialize in studying related areas, that say that over the last 150 years, the average temperature on Earth has increased by about 1 degree. Now, there are question marks about this, but in fact, this is the least important part of what we're going to talk about today. So there's quite a lot of manipulation of historical data where they say, oh, we think it was a bit colder in 100 years ago, so therefore the increase has been a bit more. And if you look at some of the recent data, so let's say last year's record in Britain was a temperature measured of just over 40 degrees Celsius, but it was actually measured next to a military runway. And it was actually a brief heat spike, which is probably more consistent with a military jet landing very nearby. So you have to be a little bit cautious of exactly how you interpret the data. There is quite a lot of margin of error in some of the data sets. But putting that to one side, let's just accept for the rest of the conversation that there has been a small temperature increase of about 1 degree over the last 150 years. Now, a much more important question then is how much of that is due to human activity? Now, with people who are sort of predicting climate doom, what they're saying is, oh, that's all due to human activity. That amount of change of 1 degree in 150 years cannot possibly have been caused by natural variation. But in fact, there are lots of scientists who say, well, hang on a minute, we don't agree with that. Because, in fact, natural variation has produced large variations in temperature over relatively short periods of time. And we're finding more and more evidence that does show that. And if you look over longer periods of time, the natural variation of the Earth's temperature is enormous. So we have ice ages where it's very, very cold over much of the Earth's surface, alternating with much, much warmer periods. So we have a lot of natural variation. So anytime you analyze data on temperature, your default position probably naturally would be to say, well, at least some of the variation is caused by natural events. If we then look at CO2, which is considered to be the main cause or one of the main causes of the human-induced climate change, then you look back to the historical data and you realize that CO2 was much, much higher in the past. And in fact, the period in the last 150 years ago was probably a historical low. And many researchers are saying that actually higher CO2 has many benefits. So, for example, it benefits crops. And what we're seeing is what is sometimes called regreening. That is, some parts of the earth, not every part of the earth, but some parts of the earth are showing that actually there's more crops growing. And then there's another set of question marks where if you look again at historical data sets, they appear to show that increases in CO2 follow increases in temperature. That is, the temperature increases for other reasons, and that then creates more CO2 being put out into the atmosphere. The idea that CO2 necessarily leads to temperature increases is an interesting theory, but we don't actually understand the way the climate works nearly as well as people claim, and we'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes. So let's say that the temperature is increasing, and some of that increase, we don't know how much, we have no way of working out how much, but some of that increase might be due to human activity. So what outcomes are we seeing? So over and over again, if you watch the mainstream media, if there's a hurricane on TV hitting landfall in America, everyone says, oh, it must be climate change. Or if there's a flood, if there's a drought or a famine or more fires, everyone says, oh, it's climate change. But actually, whenever I read the research of people who are specialists in any particular area, let's say sea level, what they say is what we've seen over the last 20 years is consistent with the historical data over the previous 150 years, which is sea level rise of 3 millimeters per year. Now, that means that in 100 years, you will get sea level rise of about 1 foot. Now, that might be increasing very slightly. The data says it's increasing very slightly. So in 100 years, you get sea level rise of between 1 and 2 feet. Okay, so that, to me, sounds like something that probably most places in the world will be able to deal with quite easily. It might cause problems in some places, and they would have to deal with that locally. So the idea that if you go back to some of Al Gore's predictions in the past saying that sea level will rise 5 meters in the next 20 years, it's all nonsense, right? It's all massive exaggeration. The evidence on something as specific as sea level is very, very slow, gradual rise that will not be catastrophic. The same is true when you look at anything else. If you look at a problem with flooding in one area, nearly always, if you speak to people who are experts in flooding, they'll say, well, actually, you can see it's out of very poor land management. They've dug up all the trees, there are no root systems holding the soil stable, so you get soil collapses and then you get more flooding in some places, and so on. If you look at, say, famine and its link with a drought, let's say, we've always had droughts. There's data from America back in the 1930s showing that enormous droughts caused immense problems. But the famines that people talk about are never just caused by a drought. They're always actually political. Every single famine could be easily avoided if politicians had better policies, such as storing food from previous years, and so on. So again, as far as we can tell, famine is not going to be a problem more than it is already. If you look at hurricanes, every time a hurricane hits landfall in America, there's a big kind of flurry by the media talking about climate change. But in fact, whilst there's a big variation in how many hurricanes you have every year or each year, over a long period of time, there is no pattern. There is no steady increase or decrease in the number of hurricanes that anyone can tell. And so the IPCC has written very detailed analysis of this, saying if you look at extreme conditions, there's very little evidence of most of them. There is some evidence that droughts are getting a bit longer, not more intense, but a little bit longer. So again, no reason to panic. It's something that we can probably deal with. And if you look at the data on how many people are harmed by extreme weather, in the last century, there's been a massive decrease simply because we're getting much, much better at dealing with the problems of extreme weather. So we're able to predict when a hurricane is going to hit landfall, and we can move things out of the way and people can take shelter and so on. So as far as we can tell, the extreme outcomes are not likely to be a serious problem. Now, the biggest question mark that I want people to focus on today is the next section, which is about the future predictions of climate catastrophe. So you have to understand that we have data and evidence for what's happened in the past, right? But everything we're told about the future comes from a mathematical model. Now, some of you will be aware that the mathematical models during, say, the financial crisis in 2008 were complete junk. The mathematical models predicting COVID catastrophe were complete junk. The COVID predictions massively exaggerated the danger posed by COVID. Well, the Earth's climate is far more complex than any of these other things that we try to model. We have very, very little understanding of the climate. We're just scratching the surface of our understanding. And so our models are extremely poor predictors of the future. We simply don't have the knowledge to be able to predict into the future. So, for example, things like underwater volcanoes, recent research is showing that there are thousands and thousands of underwater volcanoes which all pour gases into the oceans, some of which ends up in the atmosphere, that nobody even knew existed. And our understanding of currents and many other factors is extremely poor. And so the mathematical models relating to climate are very much of the type that is often described when people say garbage in, garbage out. We just don't know what information we need to put into our models, and therefore the predictions are very poor. So what you see if you look at a mathematical model of the future, let's say you're looking at sea level rise, is the IPCC will have a mid-range prediction of a very slight increase over 100 years. So that's the 3 millimeters a year that I was talking about. But the mathematical models will say, well, the upper bound, the upper limit, the worst case scenario could be many feet or many meters. And then the lowest bound, the best case scenario, well, that'll be a rise of close to zero. Well, what we've seen from the last 20 years of data, when people have been looking at these models seriously, is that the actual data is approximately halfway between the lower bound and the midpoint, the best estimate. So the models are tending to overpredict, and this is why the IPCC is backtracking on many of its worst case predictions. It's saying that actually, if we look more realistically at what the future might hold, we think probably, as far as we can tell, they're looking at a total temperature increase of maybe 2.2 degrees, which is not anything like an end of the world scenario. It'll cause some problems in places, but we can probably deal with those without making massive changes to our societies. And there's other scientists who are saying that an increase of another 1 degree C might actually be a net benefit to everybody. So if you look at Russia and Canada, they have large areas of land that cannot be farmed because it's called permafrost. That means it remains frozen all year round. Some of that would almost certainly cease to be permafrost and would become viable agricultural land. And then if we look again at the historical data, there's evidence, let's say in the Sahara, that 6,000 years ago, it was much wetter and it was not desert. So it would actually be a region where people could live and farm if we had more rainfall in the Sahara. So lots and lots of scientists are saying, well, they might accept that the temperature has increased 1 degree in 150 years, but they don't accept that that is a future catastrophe for human beings or other animals in the future. They actually think it might be a net benefit. And then the final thing is that some people talk about as if, oh, well, this is what we need to focus on. It's called tipping points. That's the idea that when the temperature gets beyond a certain point, suddenly the Greenland ice sheet will completely collapse into the sea and they'll increase sea levels by meters and meters and meters and we're all going to drown. But we have no knowledge at all about tipping points, if they're going to happen or when they might happen. It's like predicting that an asteroid might one day, sometime in the next 70 million years, hit the Earth, just like it's believed that one hit the Earth round about the time of the dinosaurs and caused such terrible consequences that the dinosaurs were wiped out. And if we really believe that our lives are going to be ended by an asteroid hitting the Earth, the policy would be you put 1 trillion nuclear missiles in outer space, all ready to shoot outwards at the first sign of an asteroid. But we don't do that because we recognize that would be a ludicrous policy. The same is true of the tipping points. You cannot base your policy around this kind of prediction that, hey, one day we think something bizarre might happen, and therefore we have to make sure it doesn't happen when we have no real knowledge of it at all. So if we then move on to what everyone is proposing as the solution, everyone's saying, hey, renewable energy or sustainable energy, and by that they tend to mean wind and solar power. Now, the interesting thing about wind and solar is the sun will keep shining forever, basically. I don't mean literally forever if somebody's an astrophysicist. I mean, as far as humans in the present day are concerned, we can think of the sun shining forever, and the wind should keep blowing around the earth indefinitely into the future. But tapping into those energy sources is very, very difficult. It's not nearly as sustainable or renewable or as eco-friendly as everybody thinks. So the energy from oil or coal or gas is incredibly dense, but the energy from wind and solar is not very dense. There's not much of it that you could get hold of at any given time. So you need enormous quantities of wind turbines and solar panels. And in order to make them, you have to dig enormous quantities of minerals out of the ground. We would have to scale up the mining practices that we currently have on an enormous scale. But if we look at mining as it exists today, it poisons huge amounts of earth, air, and water in sort of local areas. But it's also incredibly exploitative. So it includes child labor, and in some worst cases, it includes slave labor. And scaling this up on a huge scale is highly unlikely to be done in an ethical way. And every 20 to 30 years or so, all the minerals that you dug out of the ground to make your wind turbines and your solar panels, we have to replace them. We have to do it all over again. It's not just to do it once and it's there forever. You do it over and over again. So in that sense, it definitely isn't renewable or sustainable or environmentally friendly. And in fact, Michael Moore and those people who work with him picked up on this a few years ago. And that's why they made the film Planet of the Humans. So this was people who've been eco-campaigners all of their lives suddenly starting to question whether the solutions that we're proposing are really as viable as we think. And if you look at the amount of fossil fuels that we use at the moment, despite the fact that we have built significant quantities of wind and solar panels, we're still using more and more oil, coal, and gas. So the amount of renewable energy we're producing doesn't even produce enough energy to kind of fill the new stuff that we need as countries such as China become first world nations. We're still actually increasing the amount of coal, oil, and gas we're using, and it seems highly likely that that is going to continue for the next few decades. That the alternatives proposed simply are not going to scale as well as their proponents suggest. It's very, very difficult to use them to produce the quantity of energy that humans need. But there's other questions too about these sustainable or renewable energy sources. So wind and solar are intermittent. That means if they are the basis of your energy system, you need some backup. You need some batteries to store energy on a huge scale. Well, that requires enormous quantities of mining, again, on a scale that we haven't done before. Or you need some alternative methods of storing energy. And again, we haven't ever done that in a way that would scale to the amount that we require. So the solutions simply do not exist in a meaningful way yet. And it's quite likely that they won't, certainly not this century. In a century or two, we might have all sorts of wonderful new materials that we can access easily to make infinite quantities of solar panels, and it'll solve all our problems. But we're not there yet, and it's not going to happen in the next few decades. So the final thing I want to talk about is why we've got what I would call the rush to net zero. Governments have been saying, hey, we need to hit net zero by 2050. Now, a lot of people don't understand what net zero really means. It means an enormous decrease in the amount of fossil fuels we use for energy. It's not just a small decrease, it's an enormous decrease. And as I was saying before, we don't have the alternatives in place. So, for example, Europe recently tried to introduce a law saying they're going to get rid of petrol and diesel cars by 2035. Right? But at the same time, they were decreasing the amount of electricity they produce through their mainstream energy production. They were closing their nuclear plants. Well, if you stop the use of petrol and diesel cars and move over to electric cars, you need more electricity. If you close your nuclear power plants, you're producing less. And so the difference between what you need and what you've got was increasing. And so within a year, Europe was backtracking and saying, we're not going to get rid of petrol and diesel cars, as we said, because we realized that's not going to work. So people are rushing to introduce solutions that have not been carefully thought out. And the solutions are going to take time. You cannot rush them. You realize when you look back through history that every advanced nation has used fossil fuels to develop. And it seems highly likely that every poor country that's trying to become a more advanced nation will need fossil fuels to develop. And a number of researchers have started to suggest that actually the greatest danger is to transition too quickly to these alternative solutions because of the harms that will be caused, such as in the medium term, short and medium term, increased energy prices. And in fact, we had a great example of this in the last year. So there's a war going on in Ukraine. Western nations imposed sanctions on Russia, and we're not getting cheap fossil fuel energy from Russia. And the energy companies realized that this is a golden opportunity, a license to print money, basically by speculating on energy prices in the markets. Everybody's energy prices went through the roof by enormous amounts. For a brief period of time, it's settled back down again. But people are suddenly starting to realize that, hang on, if we start implementing terrible policies without thinking through all of the unintended consequences, it will cause immense harm. And the people who will suffer the most will be the poorest. So we already have people in Britain who find it almost impossible to pay their energy bills. And we have 2 million people, 2 million families using food banks because they're forced to be in a situation where they can't decide, do they pay their energy bill or do they have money to put food on the table, and they go begging for food at the food banks. So we're in a terrible situation. And remember, Britain is one of the richest nations in the world. You imagine what the problems are like in some of the poorer countries if we make it impossible for them to get cheap energy. So a number of researchers have suggested that there are other approaches to thinking about the problems that might be caused by climate change. So remember, I'm not saying that climate change will cause no problems. I'm saying that we can deal with the problems that might be caused in much, much better ways by focusing specifically on those problems, rather than throwing out everything that we've developed over the last few hundred years and saying we have to stop using fossil fuel energy altogether. So a very simple approach to deal with problems caused by flooding is simply stop building in floodplains. Just something as simple as that. And so it goes on. Everything you look at, you think, well, actually, yeah, there are much better solutions. Better land management. We could easily have policies where governments are encouraged to store food for the next year in case there's a drought, and therefore there's a possibility of a famine, and so on. So as far as I can tell, the threat is not nearly as great as people claim. So the question is, why do we suddenly have all this scaremongering? So people will be aware that over the last 3 years, the government and the media bombarded us with propaganda saying, COVID is the end of the world. Everybody's got to panic. And we all had to take these injections that they call COVID vaccines. Well, I hope more and more people are waking up to the fact that COVID was massively exaggerated. If you were healthy and under the age of about 60, the threat was really not that serious. And the COVID vaccines are the least effective, most dangerous vaccine ever introduced on a large scale. So I hope people are waking up to that. So it's always possible, if you panic, that your solution ends up being worse than the problem. And this is the danger with what's going on with climate change, that what's being proposed will end up causing far more problems than the problems caused by the climate itself. And you have to understand that there are powerful people behind the scenes manipulating the narrative. So just as with COVID, Pfizer appeared left, right, and center, providing funding to researchers and other groups of people, which is essentially, it's become a legalized bribe to say, hey, everyone's got to take the vaccine. That's the solution to our problems. It appears that there are powerful groups of people, so bankers particularly, who've realized there is a great deal of money to be made out of the entire drive towards new renewable energy systems and receiving the subsidies that governments are providing for renewable energy development. But they're also trying to develop a whole other system of payments called Payments for Ecological Services, which is sometimes called PES, where they've realized that, hey, if you create what they call a market, a way of buying and selling, the idea that, hey, there's money to be made out of leaving a tree in the ground. Let's make a tree in the ground worth something instead of having to cut it down and use the wood. Let's get people earning money for leaving a tree in the ground because that's an ecological service. It's good for our atmosphere and it's good for animals and so on. Then people can make money, and they're trying to create all entirely new markets, which will be worth trillions and trillions of pounds or dollars in the future. So I just want to finish with one final point. So the guy who originally was part of the group who set up Greenpeace, a guy called Patrick Moore, is very, very critical of what's going on at the moment. And he's saying it does sound very similar to people hundreds of years ago saying the end of the world is nigh, repent ye sinners, repent. And that everyone in advanced nations has to stop using energy and everything will be fine. And I think to some extent he has a point. You know, people are not having serious conversations about this. They're not asking the hard questions. And I think we do need to sort of take a step back and say, okay, there's a lot of propaganda in the media. You know, if the media is saying 97% of scientists agree with climate change, people think that means the scientists are saying, yeah, they think the end of the world is nigh in 50 years. That is not what most scientists are saying. And most scientists have been complaining that what they're doing is being misrepresented in the press. So most scientists might agree there has been a small increase in temperature, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a serious issue for mankind or for all the world's species in the future. You know, it's problems that probably we can deal with. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, that's it for tonight's programme. Hope you found it interesting. And remember, you can help us to grow our audience by sharing the link to tonight's show on your social media platforms. So until next week, at the same time, 7 p.m, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.